420 हो जाएं सावधान। अब शुरू हुआ एक नया अभियान, कोई भी कहीं से घुमा सकता है ये नंबर 1811-4000। टोल में हो गड़बड़ और दाम भी हो बढ़कर, या किसी तरह की और गड़बड़, तो घुमाइए ये नंबर 1811-4000। यही कंज्यूमर हेल्पलाइन।
जागो ग्राहक जागो।
So is it actually an advantage consumer? To discuss that in the studio we have a very special, very appropriate guest, Prof.S.R.Khanna, who is the managing editor of Consumer Voice. Welcome to the studios, Professor. Let me just begin by asking you, we've all heard that saying, haven't we? Consumer is king, but is he really now?
Well, you know, it's lip service actually, because consumers get the raw end of the stick. They get a bad deal all the time. Why do they have to go to court? Because companies treat them with a word I won't use, the 4-letter word.
All right.
So when companies treat their customers as that 4-letter word, they get angry, and when they get angry they have to do something about it.
And understandably so.
Of course, because if they're spending their hard-earned money and they are being misled, or they are being undersold, or they are being conned into doing something, they get very angry, whether it's 10 rupees or it's 100,000 rupees. And when they get angry, they need redress. They expect a company whose managing director is enjoying, you know, a huge pay packet, who's got a Bentley outside his house, who goes for vacation to the Bahamas.
But doesn't care about his consumer.
No, but he has to care about his consumers, and if he cannot keep his consumers happy, he's not going to have that Bahamas vacation for long.
I like the way you put that, but when you're talking about these amendments to the Consumer Protection Act of 1986, what really are we talking about here?
See, we are talking about making the law deliver justice in a much quicker and cheaper fashion. Consumer courts are alternative dispute redressal forums.
Exactly.
They're not regular courts. But the way it has gone up, the cases has gone up, it needs, and of course, because when lawyers come in, then justice is normally a casualty, because it's going to be delayed. Because lawyers like to, you know, take time, and there's litigation
Extend
that's going
things.
on. But I would like to really say that these amendments which have been drafted under the leadership of Mr. Mansingh, who just spoke. He's the Secretary of the Ministry of Consumer Affairs, and who's retiring at the end of this month. My hats off to him, because he's done a damn good job. He has actually, you know, brought in a number of issues into the consumer law amendments through a working group that was set up some time ago. That is going to make life easier for consumers. But as a consumer, I wouldn't like to advise a consumer to actually go to court.
All right, what would you advise them to do?
I would ask them to vent their anger at the tier 1. What is tier 1? The guy who sold you the stuff. Whether he's a distributor or a dealer.
So go directly to him.
Go directly to him. He will say no. Okay, he'll say go. F.O. Okay. Then you go to his boss. Who is his boss? He's the boss of the company that is selling this. But he is not manufacturing it. There's somebody, a wholesaler is behind him, and then
so you've got a whole chain.
You got a whole chain. It's a value chain. So you have to go back in that value chain in tier 1, and until the managing director of the company that produced the product or the services says no and slams the door in your face, persist with him. Call him, email him, fax him, ring his bell if he is in your same city.
So no lawyers.
Throw tomatoes at his house if you have to.
And but I wonder how many people would actually get down to doing that.
But we have a National Consumer Helpline at the University of Delhi who's going to give you the addresses of these people. So you can actually call them, email them, and fax them. So my advice to consumers is, you get angry, instead of just rushing to the court, use tier 1, and tier 1 is use all the rotten tomatoes and eggs at the guy who's actually making money from your transaction.
Professor, we'll ask you about tier 2 also, but we'll tell our viewers a bit about how really the statistics stands. Now, if you're going to file a consumer complaint, you need to follow certain rules and regulations. We'll also ask the professor about these. Now, some of these, for instance, well, you need to pay 100 rupees by demand draft or a postal order for a claim of up to 20 lakh rupees. Cases in consumer courts are meant to be disposed of within 90 days. But where the testing of a sample is involved, cases must be disposed of within 180 days. However, when you talk about in practice, cases, like we all know, take anywhere between 3 to 5 years. The first consumer court in the country was set up 18 years back. Now, over the years, cases have been piling up, with Uttar Pradesh heading the list of states with the highest number of pending cases. Then the other states, you have Gujarat, you also have Maharashtra, along with Rajasthan, that follows the above two. Let's now bring up the numbers. The total numbers, in fact. First, consumer disputes at the district level. More than 22 lakh cases have been filed till the 24th of August, and nearly 2,12,000 cases are still pending. Much fewer cases have been filed with the state commissions. Less than 4 lakh cases in all, but more than 1 lakh are pending. Which means, just very simply put, in all, more than 3 lakh consumer disputes are awaiting judgment. So then, we have the number of cases before us. It just puts to strength the fact that you have been saying that we shouldn't actually go to lawyers.
No, we should not go to lawyers as the first instance. Court is the tier 3. So I told you about tier 1, the company.
So what happens to tier 2?
Tier 2 is in between the court and the company. Now in some industries, fortunately like insurance, like banking, the government has created mechanisms called the ombudsman. There's an ombudsman. If you have an insurance problem, better go to the ombudsman. And if you are not satisfied, then only go to the court. In case of a credit card problem, debit card problem, internet banking, savings account, or problems with home loans or all kinds of loans with banks, you should go to the banking ombudsman. And only if you're not getting a solution should you go to a court. So there is of course a dearth. For example, telecom has no tier 2. Millions of people who are buying cell phones have problems with their companies and they are hardly resolved, and we are asking the TRAI to set up a telecom ombudsman like banking and insurance. So we need, I would like to appeal through this program to the government that there should be an ombudsman for every industry that deals with consumer goods and services. Otherwise, you are going to have to go to a court which already has cases pending and which are not going to be settled in 5 years.
So when you're talking about consumer courts, they're not really different from the kind of law courts that you have for justice.
Oh, no, there's a big difference. In the normal law courts, what will take 3 years here will take 10 years there.
Okay.
So you're still better off.
Comparatively speaking.
But 3 years is 3 years.
3 years is
Are you going
time.
to take your cell phone company to court because you're angry at additional charge of 220 rupees? Well, you might do so, but then over time, if it is going to take 3 years, you're not going to do it. So we need tier 2 mechanism, and we also need to find a way to take lawyers out of this. Because these are disputes between the customer and the company. So
how really do you fasten this whole procedure up, even if you're talking about courts, even if you're talking about the involvement of courts?
The only way to fasten it is to make sure that there is an international standard. It's called ISO 10002. And this has been adopted by the Bureau of Indian Standards. It's now a national standard. ISO 10002. It tells a company how to organize its internal redressal mechanism. Which means every company's board of directors, it should be made obligatory for them to have an internal redressal system, that before a person even thinks of going to a court, you should be able to address, and you should...
Right, Professor.
Yeah.
Professor, we'll continue this discussion in just a bit. You don't get cheated. We'll tell you how not to get cheated when we come back in just a bit. Stay right here with Biz Today. Welcome back. Here with Consumer is King. Now that's exactly what we're covering on Biz Today. Now if you're talking about how really do you want to file a consumer complaint, well, it has traditionally meant the seeking of help of a consumer protection group. Now these are the NGOs which take up the cudgels on your behalf. But then how about going through an industry body which may have the other party as its member? FICCI has created a first of its kind interface between the industry and the consumers, and it has been designed with your interests in mind.
It's called FICCI Alliance for Consumer Care, and it's the first initiative of its kind in the country. The first time an industry body has created an interface between the industry and the consumers. FICCI calls it a dedicated center for promotion of responsible business for consumer satisfaction. The important thing for you to know is that you can now approach this cell for redressal of your grievances as a consumer. If you have any grievance, you can approach this cell, which in turn would write to the company concerned. If required, the cell will also call the company's representatives for sorting out the issue. The idea is to cut short the litigation route followed in the consumer courts and facilitate quick redressal of consumer complaints. FICCI is better placed than other consumer forums simply because its members include most of the leading manufacturers. So it is likely to have greater influence over the companies involved in case of consumer grievances. You can even file your complaint online.
This is a body, it's a forum. Anybody can approach us through the portal or write to us or come to us. We have dedicated a separate office right on our ground floor. Anybody can walk in with a complaint, and thereafter the actions will start. We are seeking the support of the industry, and since industry is our member bodies, we certainly believe that it will be our responsibility to try and ensure that fair justice is done to the consumer for his complaint.
FICCI Alliance for Consumer Care will only act as an intermediary. It will take up your grievance for redressal and approach the companies concerned. However, it does not have any authority to make even guilty companies act in any particular manner. The cell will formulate a charter for business-consumer relationship. It also plans to train personnel from the industry to handle consumer-related issues and consumer rights. But for that, the companies will have to become signatories of the FICCI Charter. No company, however, has yet shown interest in signing the charter.
While the industry body FICCI has taken the first step towards consumer grievance redressal, it may not be enough, because the consumers need to know how this organization functions and from where does it function. And the industry has to take steps towards this direction also. Kumar Deep, Headlines Today, New Delhi.
So it's not only the consumers, not only the merchants, but also the industry that has to put steps in place. Now let's go over to Mr. Praveen Valecha, who's the COO with Higher Appliances. Mr. Valecha, thank you so much for joining us on the program. Let me just begin by asking you, is your consumer king for you?
Yeah, the consumer is the ultimate king for us, and to take care of those consumers, we have a multi-language program where we are online available for a toll-free numbers for any of those grievances. And we have a dedicated call center with a 24 hours online.
But Mr. Valecha, when you're talking about call centers, all of us know about the kind of time delay that we're actually talking about. We're not obviously talking about an immediate redressal of the consumer's problems.
Definitely there is a gap which needs to be filled in, but you can always work as a complete package in terms whenever a customer complaint comes, it has to be addressed immediately. That's what we train to our people who are dedicated. Also, in our resources, we have kept 4 dedicated personnel to online as well as, answers within 24 hours to those consumers with the complaint process. But I still admit that there is definitely a gap which comes regarding the addressing of the complaint.
Well, that's a job half done, Mr. Valecha, isn't it? At least you're admitting to that gap. But when you're talking about this gap, how do you actually propose to fill up this gap that you're talking about?
See, right now, I think there's no other way instead of increasing the manpower who can look into these complaints, and also on, the more interactive sessions with the consumers in terms of online redressal of the problems, like, various of the websites, they gives online answer for 24 hours. I think one of those ways is very quick. Plus opening a small service centers across the country, addressing those is another way of doing that. And I think the Indian infrastructures and the other companies are getting ready to get these things done very fast. And I think the way the market is growing, the way...
Right, Mr. Valecha, very briefly, when you talk just particularly about Hire, when you get any kind of problem from you consumers, what's the first thing that you do?
The first thing is, if it is regarding the product, we need to replace that product immediately. One, if it's terms of service, we take the corrective actions in terms of the concerned officials or concerned person. So there are, multi-different programs for multi-different kinds of complaint. And our CEO and MD is always on copy of all those address and the complaints. So top management is also involved in addressing the problem.
Right, Mr. Valecha. Mr. Valecha, pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us on Base Today. Professor, we'll get your inputs on this entire thing, what Mr. Valecha had to say. In just a bit, we'll take a bit of a breather and come right back. Stay with Headlines
Very
Today.
good, yeah.
Well, the consumer may be king, but there are times when you do get cheated out of the stuff that you buy. Now, if you're talking about dissatisfaction with the product that you've bought, well, don't blame the urge to splurge. After all, it makes eminent sense to shop while the discounts are on. But what do you do if the product turns out to be faulty? Again, do not despair. Help may be closer at hand than you actually realize. Here's more on it.
It pays to be a smart shopper. You don't just get the best deals, but also secure yourself against possible disappointment and harassment. You buy a product because you like it at that price. But what if the product turns out to be faulty? Even if the value involved is small, you must register your complaint. This is the only way to make manufacturers and service providers more accountable. Being a smart shopper helps in such cases. If you retain the bills for all items you have purchased, you will have the proof of purchase of any product that turns out to be faulty. make sure you retain the wrapper as well, because it will contain the batch number of the product and date of manufacture. Most companies display names and contact numbers of their consumer grievance redressal officers on their websites. Make use of this information and contact the company or the service provider concerned. When you file a complaint, make sure you get a receipt from the company acknowledging receipt of the faulty product if you submit any. If everything else fails, approach a consumer protection cell. And don't forget to get the complaint number.
You can simply go to the consumer court with the complaint, mentioning all the detailed facts and what was the defect in the product. A requisite court fee also to pay along with, and file your affidavit also, and the documentary evidence, whatever he has, the complainant has with him.
Like other courts of law, consumer courts get many more cases than they can handle. So be prepared to fight it out over the long term. But approaching a consumer court is much easier. You can file your complaint with the District Consumer Commission or State Consumer Court or Central Consumer Court, depending on the scale of the issue. In most cases, you will be allowed to defend your case yourself if you can't afford a lawyer. With Kumar Deep in Delhi, Preeti Dahiya, Headlines Today.
Well, seeking redressal, what exactly is the process that's going to make that easier? Professor, you're talking to us about the ISO 2002. What really is that, and how will it actually help this entire process?
ISO 10002 is a standard that tells companies on how to deal with customer complaints, how to set up a system inside your company, right from the point when a customer comes to you with a complaint till you have disposed of or you have told him you can't do it. It requires certain ingredients like understanding, like disposal in time, like responding to the customer. Now all these things come only when the company top management is committed. I am very sorry to say that most companies in India do not follow ISO 10002. It's not only an international standard, today it is a national standard. ISO 10002 must be followed by consumer goods companies, and they must have internal redressal systems to deal with. You can't just engage a call center and ask him to deal with the customer.
That's exactly the point, because that complaint is actually not being addressed.
That's exactly what I'm saying. So companies are taking the shortcut because they assume that the customer is a moron and you can deal with him in any way. I used, the 4-letter word, which I don't want to use again, but that's precisely why I used it, because they are not treating the customer with respect. They have not set up a system that can address. So I welcome, bodies like FICCI who are going to get involved in this.
So that will actually be beneficial for the customers when FICCI steps in.
If FICCI is able to persuade its members to follow 10002. But if the companies don't listen to FICCI, then we are...
So how much of a say do you think FICCI would actually have over its members?
It's actually persuasion 25% and consumer pressure 75%. So if consumers start getting angry and throwing rotten tomatoes and rotten eggs at the doors of the managing directors of the companies who are causing them this trouble, then I think things will,
Well, that's taking things into your own hand. But when you're talking about...
It's not an offense to throw a tomato or an egg. You are just expressing your feelings.
But I'm sure there are other ways of going about it. All right,
yes.
one perspective
No,
would be...
if a company does not reply to your letter, doesn't take your calls, does not appoint an officer to listen to you in person, what else can you do except use tomatoes and eggs? And I'm sure you can get them free outside many shops, all the
no redressal grievances against that. Professor, thank you so much for joining us on the program with your inputs on what really is consumership all about, what really are the ways that consumers' grievances can be addressed. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.